"I can't close my legs," little girl told bikers. What happened next made the whole town go silent. The leather-clad bikers had stopped at the rural gas station like they did every Saturday morning, their Harleys gleaming in the early sunlight, engines rumbling like distant thunder. They were an intimidating sight with their tattooed arms, weathered faces, and chains hanging from their belts, the kind of men that made mothers pull their children closer and store clerks keep one hand near the panic button. But on this particular morning in the small town of Millbrook Creek, everything was about to change because of 7 words spoken by a little girl that would shatter every assumption, break every hardened heart, and ultimately transform an entire community in ways no one could have imagined. Her name was Emma Rose Patterson, and she was only 7 years old when she limped up to the group of 12 bikers standing outside Joe's Gas and Go, her small frame barely reaching their waists, her left leg dragging behind her in a way that made it clear something was terribly wrong. She had sandy blonde hair that hung in tangled strands around her thin face, eyes that were far too old for her young years, and clothes that had seen better days, worn and patched and clearly handed down through too many owners. The bikers noticed her immediately, this tiny figure approaching them with determination written across her face despite the obvious pain each step caused her, and their conversation died away as she stopped in front of the man who appeared to be their leader, a massive figure named Marcus "Bear" Wellington who stood 6'5" and weighed nearly 300 pounds of solid muscle, his beard reaching halfway down his chest and his arms covered in intricate ink that told stories of a life lived on the edge. Emma looked up at Bear with those haunting eyes and said the words that would echo through Millbrook Creek for years to come, "I can't close my legs, mister, and I need help." The statement hung in the air like a physical thing, shocking in its innocence and devastating in its implication, and for a moment the world seemed to stop spinning as 12 hardened men suddenly found themselves confronted with something their rough lives had never quite prepared them for. A child in desperate need speaking truth with the kind of raw honesty that only comes from someone too young to know how to hide their pain behind polite words and social niceties. If you believe in the power of kindness, in second chances, and in the incredible things that can happen when strangers choose compassion over indifference, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Tales so you never miss another story that might restore your faith in humanity. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because what these bikers did in the minutes, hours, and days that followed would prove that you can never judge a book by its cover, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who show up exactly when they're needed most, ***. Bear crouched down immediately, bringing his massive frame to Emma's level, and his voice when he spoke was surprisingly gentle, like distant thunder that promised rain but not destruction. He asked her what she meant, his eyes taking in the way she stood with her legs apart, the tremble in her small body, the dried tear tracks on her dusty cheeks. Emma explained in that matter-of-fact way that children have when describing their own suffering that her legs hurt all the time, that she couldn't walk right, that her hips felt like they were on fire whenever she tried to stand with her feet together, and that nobody seemed to care or have time to do anything about it. She told them she'd walked all the way from the trailer park on the edge of town, nearly 2 miles on legs that barely worked, because she'd overheard her grandmother saying that sometimes bikers helped people, that they did charity rides for sick kids, and Emma had decided that maybe, just maybe, they could help her too. The story that emerged over the next hour, as Bear and his crew listened with growing horror and determination, was one that explained so much about the little girl standing before them and the town that had somehow failed her so completely. Emma lived with her grandmother in a rusted single-wide trailer after her mother had died from an overdose 2 years earlier and her father had disappeared long before that, becoming just another name on an arrest warrant and a fading memory of someone who'd never really been there anyway. Her grandmother, a woman named Dorothy Patterson who was only 58 but looked 80, worked 2 jobs trying to keep them fed and housed, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, too exhausted and too broke to do more than survive one day at a time. Emma had been born with a condition called developmental dysplasia of the hip, a medical term that basically meant her hip joints hadn't formed correctly in the womb, and without proper treatment in her early years, the condition had progressively worsened until walking caused her constant pain and her mobility was severely compromised. Dorothy knew something was wrong, had known since Emma was a toddler, but between working minimum wage jobs with no benefits, having no health insurance, and living in a rural area with limited medical resources, she'd been unable to do anything about it except watch her granddaughter suffer and pray that somehow things would get better on their own. The local emergency room had seen Emma twice, both times when the pain had become unbearable, and both times they'd given her ibuprofen, told Dorothy that the child needed to see an orthopedic specialist, and sent them home with bills they couldn't pay and referrals to doctors who were hours away and cost money they didn't have. It was the kind of situation that fell through every crack in the system, a child suffering in plain sight while bureaucracy and economics and simple human oversight created a prison of pain that seemed to have no escape, no solution, no hope for anything better. Bear stood up slowly after Emma finished talking, and something had changed in his face, a hardness replacing the initial shock, but it was the kind of hardness that came from determination rather than anger. He turned to his crew, men with names like Diesel, Snake, Roadkill, and Preacher, men who'd lived rough lives and made mistakes and found brotherhood in the rumble of engines and the open road, and he saw his own thoughts reflected back in their faces. They'd all been in dark places, had all needed help at some point, had all been judged by their appearance and written off by polite society, and here was a little girl who'd looked past their intimidating exteriors and asked them for the one thing they could actually provide, a chance to make a real difference in a life that desperately needed saving. What happened in the hours immediately following that conversation became the stuff of local legend in Millbrook Creek, the kind of story people would tell for generations about the day the motorcycle club rolled into town and turned everything upside down in the best possible way. Bear made a phone call to a member of their extended riding family, a man named Dr. James Chin who rode with them on weekends but spent his weekdays as a pediatric orthopedic surgeon at a major hospital 3 hours away. Within 30 minutes, Dr. Chen had made arrangements for Emma to be seen that very afternoon, pulling strings and calling in favors and making it clear that this was happening whether the hospital administrators liked it or not. Meanwhile, the other bikers split up with military precision, some going to the trailer park to talk with Dorothy, others hitting up local businesses to explain the situation, and still others making calls to friends and family and anyone else they thought might help. Dorothy Patterson had been terrified when she arrived home from her morning shift at the diner to find her granddaughter missing, her fear multiplying exponentially when she discovered Emma had left a note written in crayon saying she'd gone to find the bikers who could help. She'd been preparing to call the police, her hands shaking and her heart pounding, when 5 massive men on motorcycles pulled up outside her trailer, and her fear had transformed into something close to panic until they explained who they were and why they were there. The relief that flooded through her when she understood that Emma was safe and that these intimidating strangers were actually trying to help was so overwhelming that she'd simply broken down, weeks and months and years of stress and worry and helplessness pouring out in great racking sobs while these tough bikers stood awkwardly around her, offering rough comfort and promises that things were about to change. The ride to the hospital was something Emma would remember for the rest of her life, sitting in Bear's truck flanked by Dorothy while the motorcycle club formed an escort convoy around them, their engines roaring and their presence commanding attention from every vehicle they passed. Dr. Chen met them in the parking lot, having driven at speeds that probably violated several traffic laws to get there in time, and he'd examined Emma with a gentleness that belied his gruff exterior while explaining in terms they could understand exactly what was wrong and what could be done about it. The news was both devastating and hopeful. Emma needed surgery, extensive surgery that would involve reconstructing her hip joints, followed by months of physical therapy and ongoing medical care. The cost would be astronomical, easily reaching into 6 figures, the kind of money that might as well have been $1 billion for a family that sometimes struggled to afford groceries. But Dr. Chen had smiled when he delivered that news, a knowing smile that suggested he'd already thought several steps ahead, and he'd told them not to worry about the cost because he was going to perform the surgery pro bono and he'd already started making calls to ensure the hospital would waive their fees and that the rehabilitation costs would be covered through various charitable programs and grants. Dorothy had started crying again, unable to comprehend that strangers were doing this for them, that help had arrived in the most unexpected form after years of struggling alone, and Emma had simply hugged Bear's leg, this tiny girl embracing this massive man, and told him thank you in a voice so small and sincere that every person in that room had to look away and blink hard against the sudden moisture in their eyes. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later, Time needed to complete preoperative testing and prepare Emma's small body for the extensive procedure she'd be undergoing,